Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire. No surprise there. Developing some innovative technology for wildfire mitigation, suppression, attack, etc., etc. Wah, wah. Check it out on the website, teamwildfire.com. I have got Chief Dave Winnacker with us today. And Chief Winnacker is one of the more influential characters in this battle against wildfire devastation. Welcome to the show. How are you today, Dave?
I'm good, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, all right, Dave, a lot of people are trying to do something to help with the wildfire problem. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of commotion, a lot of ideas, but some of them actually might have merit. And I guess one of the things it seems that you're working on is figuring out of all the ideas in the pot right now, what are the ones that could be most effective? What are the ones that are science backed? What are the ones that have political will behind them, all of the factors. So what are some of the things that you're sorting out and who are you working with?
Yeah, so working with Frank Freevolt now at the Cal Poly Wooey Institute, formerly the fire chief of Mammoth, Nancy Watkins from Milliman, who runs their San Francisco climate office, as well as the California Fire Chiefs Association, the Western Fire Chiefs Association, and the amazing team at the Moore Foundation's Wildfire Initiative. We've been really focused on is alignment, and that is alignment around the mitigations that matter. What are the core things that will reduce the number of homes that burn? And I think it's very important to distinguish the component parts of the wildfire issue. Thing one, the West, and most of the world for that matter, but the American West specifically is a fire-dependent landscape. It's intended to burn. Excluding fire from the landscape is part of how we got here. And thoughtful people will say that, and then in the next sentence will nod along as someone advances swarming drones or satellites that drop water balloons or whatever the thing is. And while there's a place for that, and there's room for technology and for innovation here, further industrialization of our firefighting capacity is just going to lead to more exclusion of fire from the landscape. And then the landscape will be out of basis, out of balance. And we
so you
need
feel like it'll be
to
misused? Like the ideal use would just be asset protection, but that it'll get more broadly used for putting out what they call good fire.
If you have a hammer in your hand, you tend to treat every problem as a nail,
Sure.
as an example.
And
So,
you end up bloody
so I think
thumb,
it's important recognizing that these are fire dependent landscapes. I think it's important to break the wildfire problem into two distinct parts. Part one is forested landscape restoration. Now, in my opinion, that's going to be a multi-generational task that's going to involve a lot of different things and is not my area of expertise. But it is certain that fire is going to be part of the solution there, which brings me to the second part of the problem, which is vulnerable communities with exposure or fuel continuity that leads to those forested landscapes. And as long as we have vulnerable communities that are present across the landscape, managers will be constrained in their ability to use fire for beneficial outcomes because the communities will feel threatened and they will demand that fires be put out instantly. And so the part that Frank and Nancy and I are working on is how do we reduce the vulnerabilities in these communities so that a community can be in or adjacent to a fire perimeter without experiencing loss. And that really comes down to the core mitigations that matter. What are the mitigations on and around our homes that will reduce fire? And that's really where, not reduce fire, I'm sorry, that will reduce the probability of home ignition should a wildland fire inevitably occur in the region.
When it occurs.
Right, which I think is a matter of if not when. Fire-dependent landscapes will burn and are going to burn. There's a fire burning today.
When, not if, really, right?
I'm sorry, Steve?
When, not if.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. That fires will burn here. Fires should burn here. If fires don't burn here, we're going to have a host of other problems.
Right, huge fuel buildups. So you're focusing on what do individuals do to keep their homes from burning down, and what do community managers do to keep the community resources from burning down?
It's correct, and this is where the sum of the parts starts to matter. So fire spreads through a network effect, and if the home, which is the asset, is also within 50 feet of another home, then it becomes the peril. That if home 1 begins to burn, it is likely to ignite home 2 if the structure separation distance is 50 feet or less.
Okay.
And so then we end up with this problem where the home has been prepared to receive wildfire, has defensible space and home hardening measures in place. But that's insufficient if an adjacent structure is burned, because the structure will burn longer and hotter and produce flux, the watts per meter squared over time, that exceed what the home would be exposed to if it were a vegetation fire. And
I
so
see.
while there's an individual component, but in dense or semi-dense suburban settings, there's an aggregate as well. So it's important that we understand how fire will enter the community. We understand what the vulnerabilities are at those points of entry, and we move to mitigate those. And we understand how the presence or absence of those mitigations at the entry points implicate the survivability of the rest of the community. And that's where you mentioned earlier about activity. So I served in the Marine Corps before I got into the fire service, and we
Thank you
have
for your service.
a theory of measures of performance, which is activity. We did a lot of things,
Right.
versus measures of effectiveness, which what were the outcomes? And right now part of this is that it's early days, and we're all still learning, and we're getting better at this. But there's a lot of measures of performance, right? We report how many acres of fuel breaks we've put in, how many prescribed fires we've executed, how many fire-wise neighborhoods we've created. But there's a disconnect between those measures of performance and what the effect of those acres were. Right? Not all fuel break acres were created equally, and not all fire-wise neighborhoods have met a standard that is particularly meaningful. And so I think it's important to move, and this is an evolution. We ought to be learning and growing as we get smarter about this. We need to move beyond the measures of performance and to the outcomes and measures of effectiveness. We have treated this many acres at these critical nodes that will now cut off or slow these fire pathways, which means this number of entry points now have gained additional arrival time. And with that additional arrival time, we'll be able to evacuate this many residents and aggregate this many firefighters, right? So stopping a fire is generally, it's not reasonable to expect a passive measure to stop a fire, a fuel break, et cetera. It will slow a fire. But slowing the fire, the second question is, what did you do with that time? And this is work we've been doing through the Western Fire Chiefs with funding from the Moore Foundation to create a WUI response rating. So we understand how many firefighters with what equipment and under what command relationships will be available in what time frame. So we understand what we actually bought with that additional time, that a fuel break or a treatment area, splat, pod, et cetera. What did we do to create that? And then in a related manner, what remaining vulnerabilities are there at the points of entry? How many of these homes have defensible space? How many of these homes still have a wood shake roof and haven't retrofitted their vents, don't have a zone 0? And then we can comprehensively start to understand the risk, and we can answer the question of how much wildfire preparedness, money, resources, time a community should spend, instead of the answer always being more. And right now, I think if you talk about fuel breaks or something like that, the answer is always more. We need more of them, but to what end? And I think that's important because a community has a finite amount of resources. A community has a finite will to act. If we don't spend our time and our money wisely, we're going to run out. And when we run out, we're going to have to maintain. Right? So we need to choose our treatment areas wisely.
So that's very interesting, thinking about that in terms of how do you allocate limited resources, right?
Right.
We have resources for fire mitigation. We need a police department. We need vaccinations. We need school teachers. So,
Absolutely.
obviously, yes, if the whole community burns down, everything is moot. So it's not an insignificant portion, but you can't spend your whole budget on it.
Right. It's a constrained optimization problem. And there are definitely diminishing returns. And we want to understand where the resources will have the greatest impact, the greatest return on investment, so that as we compete with other things, we can demonstrate the need for this. And I would point out that over the last, 5-6 years that we've all been very focused on wildfire, we've been in a time of essentially unconstrained budgets. We've had budget surpluses, a lot of resources flowing in. Eventually, those are going to tighten up, maybe very soon, at which point we're going to need to be very thoughtful about what we spend.
We spend billions of dollars a year treating heart disease, and no one ever says stop doing heart surgery.
Right, absolutely.
So I don't know if they're just going to mint more money for this or handle it in a fiscally responsible way. Uh, so of the things that are, of the activities going, first of all, I want to ask you about metrics since you seem to speak in a science vocabulary. Um, are you in a geographic area where the metrics being reported by different entities are consistent with each other? I spoke with Patrick Wright the other day, and he was saying, well, every community measures acres treated in a different way. Some people measure it once it's fully treated. Some people measure it each of the 3 times they had to treat it. How are you dealing with the metric issues?
Uh, I agree with everything Patrick Wright mentioned. The lack of standardized reporting formats, unsurprisingly, things are being reported in many different ways or not reported at all. But I think back to the previous point, it is more important than the acres is to look at outcomes. So
Yeah.
how many homes have exposure or are at the transition of a vegetative fire pathway to the built environment? How many of those homes are have vulnerabilities on and around them? How many firefighting resources are available? And what is the expected arrival time from an estimated ignition point? And what have we done to change that? What is the net effect of our work and of the maintenance of our work? Because there's a decay on these things. And depending on the fuel model, if you're putting in treatments in grass, 6 months later, it'll grow right back. There's no
Right.
residual value. So I think it's really important to look at the vulnerabilities. If what we are responding to is largely structures lost, and I think we are, then we should be focusing our metrics and reporting on the number of structures with vulnerabilities that are on those transition points where a vegetative fire will become a structure fire. And we start to see the initiation of a conflagration. And then conflagration blocks, right? What's the potential spread? So you can have a sense of how many homes are exposed to the threat of wildfire and what you have done to reduce that. So year over year, you could track the number of homes that were on or adjacent to an entry point. How many of them had vulnerabilities? Yes, no. How many vulnerabilities? You could see a reduction in that. And then how many of the pathways that would bring fire to those points of transition have maintained treatments along them designed to slow the fire. They're creating a labyrinth around a community. So we're not trying to build a wall because
Right.
the fire will jump right over it, but we're creating an obstacle belt through which the fire will have to creep that will slow it down.
Okay. And then, so um, you have to have a predicted outcome that you measure your actual outcome against, right? You have to say under these weather, fire, topography, humidity, etc. conditions, we would expect X number of fire losses. And then based on our mitigation, we got more or less than that, hopefully less.
Right. Well, I think, Steve, just to back that up, wildfire modeling is it's complex, but the inputs are simple. It's topography, weather, and fuel, and nothing else. And the topography is known and unchanging. The weather, we can look at historical models and take something around the 97th percentile for a worst case, because that's the weather we're concerned about. And then we look at the fuel as it is present now, and as we can model the impacts of treatments. And then that's used to create the plan. And then we execute the plan working in parallel along vegetative treatments on the landscape and defensible space and home hardening at the points of transition. So we can track 2 measures. One, what is the probability of fast moving fire coming into the community without delay? Because time is of the essence. More time equals more time to evacuate residents, more time to aggregate firefighters, more time to set up command and control systems, right? Slow moving fires don't burn homes. Fast moving wind driven fires burn homes, because slow moving fires, by the time the fire arrives at the value at risk or the vulnerability, there's a firefighter there. And if you have a fire engine in the driveway, that home doesn't burn under all but the most extraordinary circumstances. So what have we done to impact the pathways to slow the fire? And then what have we done to reduce the vulnerabilities so that if there's a fast moving fire or that fire outpaces the firefighting response, so the relative speed is greater, then we have more passive measures in place, which means we need fewer active measures in the form of firefighters. And so it's a series of sliders, right? Do we have a lot of firefighters? Well, then we don't need as many of these things. Do we have a lot of treatments on the landscape? Well, then we don't need as many defensible space and home hardening. Do we not have a lot of treatments on the landscape and we don't have a lot of firefighters? Well, then we need defensible space and home hardening all day long. But it is all of the above. And I think one of the challenges is that too many of our approaches now are flowing to what's the essentially easier to carry out, and that being fuel breaks or other treatments on the landscape, because you don't have to go door to door. You don't have to deal with residents and deliver the tough love that, hey, I'm your fire chief and I'm here to, stickers and hats for the kids. Everyone loves the fire department. But oh, by the way, I'm the one who's telling you have to take out your prize rosemary or your rose bushes or your boxwoods or what other vegetation that around people's homes that they have an emotional attachment to. That is a very tough message to deliver. And I'm here to testify. Communities don't like receiving that message. And so we naturally then gravitate towards a message that's easier to deliver. We're going to go do fuel breaks on the landscape, which involves someone else doing something. But again, if we're responding to structure loss, it's unavoidable that the greatest return on investment, the greatest value to protecting homes is defensible space and home hardening on and around the home. If you want to protect your head, you wear a helmet. Right. If you want to protect a home, we need to put the treatments on the home. That's where they're most effective. It's simple, but very difficult to carry out, right? Not complex, but the execution is very, very difficult.
I see. Okay. You talked about the three factors of topography, weather, and fuels. Do you add the presence of humans to that? You take any given national park and you shut it down, your likelihood of fire drops dramatically when people aren't there lighting campfires and throwing cigarettes out and driving with their hot mufflers across the grass.
Right. Yeah. So this is a topic that comes up a lot, specifically around utilities and utility-caused ignitions. In the Mediterranean counties of California, specifically, 97% of fires are anthropogenic in origin. Humans start them. In the mountains, it drops to about 70% because of lightning and other factors. But humans are just a source of ignition. And long before there were humans and power lines, the West burned. It burned a lot more than it does now.
Yeah.
Right?
You mean more frequently or more acreage?
More acres and more frequently. Fewer ignitions, but more acreage because they were unconstrained, right? And Scott Stevens from UC Berkeley estimates 4 to 6 million acres burned per year in California before European arrival. Right? In 2020, which we said was cataclysmic, worst year ever, we hit 4.25 million acres. We hit the bottom end of the historical range in that year.
Wow.
So my point is that the human cause ignitions. That's true. Other things cause ignitions as well. And if you exclude people on certain days, you're less likely to see fire in those days. I will note you can't exclude people from urban and suburban communities where we're concerned about fires.
Right.
And every fire we don't burn means that fuel load carries over to a subsequent year. And if we are headed to a hotter, drier future, I'm quoting Kate Dargan here, which is, if you believe we're headed to a hotter, drier future, we should be burning every acre we can right now. Because it's going to be worse when it burns in 2030, 40, or 50. And if we don't burn it now, we're essentially deferring the payment. And it will come due in the form of a balloon payment in a catastrophic event.
I see. Okay. Wow. Who else do you like to quote?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of quoting Kate Dargan and Bob Roper, Frank Freevold. There's so many smart people who have been working in this space for so long. It's been tremendously helpful to be able to learn from them and try to stand on their shoulders as we seek to implement progressive, interesting things. And when I think in this space, what's old is new. What is new is that there's now a lot of interest in an area that, because of aggressive suppression, we were able to ignore for a long time. And now it's coming back. I mean, the Park Service, National Park Service, started experimenting with controlled burns and managing natural ignitions back in the 70s. This isn't a new idea, right, but it is a new scale. It's not just something out in the woods anymore. Now it's around our communities.
Right. Cultural burning's been around for how long?
Forever and ever. Exactly. And right, it's the exclusion of fire is how we got here. So there is no future that doesn't feature fire in the American West. And I get very concerned, as we talked about before, with some of the tech things, well-meaning, innovation, potentially really neat, can do good things. But I think it advances something of a false narrative that there is a potential future in which technology can eliminate fire from the landscape. And I just don't think that's realistic.
Or desirable.
Right, exactly. And fire-dependent landscapes need fire. So the tech and the innovation is useful. We need that. The other point, though, is we also need the pre-fire passive measures to reduce vulnerabilities. Right, our existing communities weren't built with fire in mind. one of the very interesting things we've been doing with Rancho Mission Viejo and other developers is advising on how you can build new communities with fire in mind. You can develop them in a way that they're resilient and prepared to receive fire. That moving forward, a lot of good work there. A lot of opportunities to build communities that are fire adapted. Retrofitting existing communities, though, needs to happen, which is going to be slow, difficult work. And innovation, particularly innovation in the suppression space, doesn't preclude the need to adapt our existing communities. And that's, I always get concerned when you see a camera, a drone, a satellite, and residents quickly ask, "Oh, does this mean we solved the wildfire problem?" It absolutely does not.
It's done. Yep, that camera is going to get off that pole. It's going to come over. It's going to put out this fire.
100%.
Climb back up on the pole.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and
Right.
the camera and the other tools, they're helpful, but they don't remove the need to eliminate the vulnerabilities in those homes at those points of transition.
Supposedly, fire is a physical reality, not a data concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's the drone thing, right? The drone is
I mean,
is
you
just a
were in
sensor
the
carrying
Marines,
package.
right? Can you imagine, being given unlimited intel on enemy positions and capabilities, but they don't give you your rifle?
Right. Knowing where it is doesn't mean you can do anything about it, especially under high wind conditions. If you have choked, decadent fields full of fuels that haven't seen fire in 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Of the text that you're seeing, how would you break down the ratio of, data tools, intel gathering tools versus actual suppression tools?
It's probably an even split. And as I said, I think there's a need for both. But the question with the data is, what are we going to do with the data? Right? Having data for data's sake doesn't solve the problem.
No.
It can allow us to carry out more informed analysis and to come up with better plans and to track the progress of those plans. But we need to be tracking outcomes, not measures of performance. Right? More data doesn't help if we're not looking at the right outcomes. And then the suppression side, particularly things that reduce the exposure of firefighters to dangerous conditions and allow us to selectively suppress small fires in the incipient phase. I think those are great. But I believe very strongly they fall into part of the all of the above approach. And none of those things by themselves are going to solve what is a really complex problem with lots of different mitigations that need to be taken in parallel so that we see the additive value of all these layers.
We'll see. Yeah. Let me ask you about fire chess, as the name would imply. So the fire has assets, right? They have players on their side of the table, topography, fuel, weather. On your side of the table, you have, aerial drops and helicopters and aviation assets and trucks and guys and hoses and axes and bagged lunches and toothbrushes. Right? So how do you decide what's the ideal deployment of the resources that you have for any given mission? And how gamified is that? Is that just collective wisdom? Well, this is how we usually do it, and 6 chiefs all agree. Or have we considered the use of AI to say, well, here's 100,000 different ways you could go about allocating these resources? And do we have a bias towards the things we've done before that might be interfering with our ability to discover new ways that might be better?
Well, I think back to the point I made at the beginning of the discussion about these are two very different discussions. If we're talking about typically a federal fire in a forested landscape in a rural community at tens to hundred thousands of acres over multiple operational periods, I think there's definitely room for decision support tools and use of game theory and big data and crunching it, looking for patterns and so forth. I think that stands in sharp contrast to a fast-moving, wind-driven WUI fire, where things are unfolding so quickly and that we don't have the standing command team or headquarters in place, and a lot of things are happening on the fly, and the community is going to receive fire as it is. I think early stages of battle, if we want to use that analogy. On an extended campaign fire with multiple operational periods, command structures in place, We do a lot of that now. There's a strategy. The strategy is developed by the command and general staff through a series of war games. As you run through the planning P, you are taking a look at the conditions, at the values at risk, the objectives, resources available, time, resources available, figuring out how best to allocate them, and then you reinforce success. We come up with a plan, we execute, plan early, plan often, and as we're executing the plan, you figure out where it is working, you reinforce that, figure out where it is not working, you come up with a new plan. I would point out, though, I've heard a lot of things having to do specifically with fire perimeters and intelligence that suggest the daily update with regard to perimeter is inadequate, and that the operations chief needs up to the minute. And I kind of chuckle that I don't know that anyone's actually asked an operations chief, type 1, type 2, complex incident operations chief, if they want that. Because there is a flash to bang, there's a reflex time that from the minute you say the fire is here and you come up with your plan, which can be relatively quick, and you assign the resources, which also relatively quick. We're moving things around on a Trello board or some other tool. It used to be T cards. But then you've got to get people in trucks and they've got to drive and sometimes hours of drive time to get to the ground. And when they get to the dirt that they've been assigned, they need to assess it, that it actually looks like the satellite, the intel, the plan thinks it looks like. And they have to figure out what's changed in the several hours it took for them to get from wherever they were to this place. And if you look at this from a game theory perspective, as in real life, when you reassign resources, particularly if it involves a move, you essentially take them out of play for hours or a day to shift them around. This gets even worse, kind of conversely, with equipment. If you're using heavy equipment that has to be loaded up for transport and then unloaded and transport shuffled around and all sort of things, you can now lose them for days. And so there is a degree of set it and forget it, where you get people assigned, they get to their assigned location, they're able to start working on the tasks they've been assigned. There's such a time penalty to moving them that leaving them where they are, where it's perhaps a little less efficient, sometimes makes more sense. And this is true not just for fire. I mean, this is true in the military setting as well. Moving things, particularly things that are engaged with fighting fire, engaging the enemy, is really difficult and takes a long time. And so knowing where the fire is up to the minute sometimes isn't particularly helpful because you can't do anything about it. To your point about knowing all of the intel but not being given any offensive tools. So there's a time and a place for this. There's also a finite number of action points. Right? Generally speaking, you can't fight fire mid-slope. If the fire is below you, you don't do that for a lot of reasons. If it's above you, you don't do that typically because you can have rollout where fire is now established below you and it's one of our watchouts. And you don't generally fight fire down in the bottom of a valley because the access is so difficult. You get cross-compartment spotting and all sorts of things that are not good. So you're kind of constrained to ridge tops in a wildland setting. Now, there's exceptions to that, as there is to everything, but as a general statement. And there's a finite number of ridge tops. And if you are unable to hold it at ridge top 1, your next logical control point is to fall back potentially miles to ridge top 2 and start over again. And so there are some limits on what our options are just because of firefighting safety. And I think that's where, from the innovation space, more of the unmanned systems start to open up options to do things that would be considered too risky today. You could put some autonomous machinery in a mid-slope road, and if it burns, someone's going to write a check. But we're not folding flags. So there's some real opportunities that I think automation can open up with regard to increasing the number of decision opportunities. And perhaps at that point, there would be real need for AI and decision support tools because incident commanders and ops chiefs just wouldn't have the experience, right? Their lived experience wouldn't account for the fact that now there's an automated macerator in there chopping up the roadside instead of a bunch of humans with saws.
Robotic hotshots.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that only a human can do. Shots in particular are tremendously useful because you can move them quickly. They can get into places that machinery can't access, and they are able to make independent decisions on the ground about what of the full suite of suppression tactics makes sense, to include the use of fire. Right. And they can do it autonomously because they don't require any external input, right? Tremendously useful. On the other hand, it's humans, and we need to make sure that those humans are safe and that they have the ability to bail out. And that's really one of the distinctions that is a difficult transition as you move out of the structure fire space, where because there's a life component, and you have a much or you have a fully encapsulating protective gear, right? The idea of what constitutes risk is very, very different in an isolated rural setting than in a suburban structure fire. And so there are always cultural challenges. And I think those cultural challenges, when the time comes, will be worth studying and understanding, because we'll have similar cultural challenges as we start to try to integrate automated systems into this area that heretofore had been all human-based and all intuition and experience and lived past events.
Right. How do we consolidate that lived experience into, synthetic knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. And then how do we do that in a
There's that
way?
little cube that has the wisdom of 500 fire chiefs in it, right?
Well, right, but it's still constrained to decision support, right? Especially because there's people and their lives. I really struggle to see any scenario in which you go full auto on these things, where the box is making the decision. But if the box is framing up potential outcomes and making recommendations, there's real value there. But that's going to take time. This is back to my Marine Corps lieutenant days in the late 90s. The first generation GPS was called a plugger. And there was this sense that a human with a brain and a compass and a map is always better. And we regularly would say, the plugger's wrong. And the plugger was never wrong. We were always exactly where the GPS said we were. But it took time for people to begin to trust the box with the antenna instead of their hand and their brain and the compass, the tangible thing they could hold. That took real time to break down those barriers.
Let me ask you, I think you're in an ideal position with the military background and a civilian job, in an area where I think it may go back the other way, which is to say that I think that if we viewed wildfire devastation as a military threat, and we deployed military resources, military budgets, military technology and strategies, that would be a huge boon to civilian wildland firefighting.
I would argue we have in many ways. And if we look at the size of the resources we're putting against these things, we regularly see 7,000 to 10,000 people assigned with hundreds of pieces of equipment. That starts to feel like a division with attached armor.
Is the level of technology up to what it would be if we were using that? If we were protecting
really one of the only things that we're constrained on the civilian firefighting side is access to intel coming off of some high side systems with IR. That can be seen through a few programs that a small number of state employees in California and Colorado can see real-time, unfiltered raw data from the satellites. The rest of us cannot. But other than that, I really think if you look at the aircraft that are flying and the numbers of them, you look at the radio systems that are in place, the number of people, vehicles, training, resources put against the problem, there are military-esque components, both in scale and the type of technology being employed on the firefighting side. I don't know that. As I say, I'm not sure that this is we need more firefighters. I think one of the biggest challenges is that the way we are structured now, firefighting is incentivized because of the hazard, and there's pay, there's opportunities, there's all sorts of things, there's prestige built around firefighting. Unlocking some of those incentives to support pre-fire activities, treating prescribed fires as a deployment, bringing in massing resources, establishing fire camps to support large-scale prescribed fires. Some of those things, I think, are where the opportunity lies, taking the deployment model that we already have for fire suppression, which has many military connections and undertones to it, and applying that, or administratively unlocking the ability to use those same funding streams, those same resource ordering, et cetera, for prescribed fire and for treatment opportunities, so that we can mass effects. And that really is one of the challenges, is that when we're fighting a fire, we mass effects. And sometimes we mass those effects to put the fire out, when it might have been better to mass those effects to let it burn. Right? But it's full suppression
opportunistic prescribed burn.
Absolutely. Right. So,
You
so
made the
managing
prescription
naturally occurring.
decision after the fire started.
Yes, and I think, well, there's two sides to that, right? One is managing fires that have already started. We didn't start it, but we're going to manage it and nurse it along to do good things. And the other is massing people on a planned basis to carry out prescribed projects, the thinning and burning, right? Which a lot of what we do on a wildfire is contingency lines preparing for a fire to get to that point. And then when it's done, we rehab them, clean them all up, put them back, put them away. Right. And that, I think that's where it would be really helpful that if we had the administrative ability to either in a pre-planned setting do this, or when a fire is burning, use that as an opportunity to carry out the projects that had been planned and approved for that area, since we already have everyone there anyway, and really start to try to take areas off the board for the next 5-10 years as we masked effects. Instead of whack-a-moling it little here, little there, and spending a lot of time putting fires out, some of which we probably ought to keep burning for beneficial effects.
So you have to decide before the fire hits whether an area is one that you'll allow to continue to burn if it does burn.
Yeah, and that's we're simplifying something that's tremendously complicated for a lot of reasons, to include the political aspect. Right? There have been letters from Western governors and others demanding to know why the Forest Service wasn't putting fires out. So there's challenges here, and if residents don't like to see fire, they don't like smoke in the air. There are all of those challenges, and so continuing the ongoing conversation with residents of the West to build that comfort level that fire is a necessary and beneficial feature of the landscape. It's not a bug to be suppressed, and burning things now under these conditions is going to have long-term beneficial effects. That's a hard conversation. It's a necessary conversation. And we also need to understand that there's no certainty here. There are going to be managed fires that do things we didn't plan on them doing. That's going to happen. It's not possible to have a zero defect mentality there. And that gets into some really complex spaces, particularly in some rural communities where there are longstanding tensions between federal land policies and the residents. But as I said, that's why I think there's two distinct ways of looking at this problem. One is a landscape rural communities, one isolated rural communities. The other is a dense suburban WUI setting community. Two very different problems, two very different sets of approaches are needed. And if we try one size fits all, it's just not going to.
Yeah, and I can see where the tensions would come up when there's probably a bias. Oh, it's a rural fire. Let it go. Hey, wait a minute. I live in this rural area. Oh, but when you guys have your urban fire, no houses could be allowed to burn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not suggesting we let houses burn, but I do think, it shouldn't be lost on anybody that there are times where, one particular was on a fire in a federal forest. There was this great opportunity to bring the fire down to the river in an area that needed the fire. It was a great backing fire, everything great. There was a cabin in a really bad spot that we expended a ton of time and effort to keep fire out of that one cabin. And as a result of that, we ended up with a big chunk of acres that didn't get fire on them that would have been a good thing. And the punchline is the cabin was for sale.
The cabin what?
The cabin was for sale. It was actively listed on Redfin for sale. And we just had a joke, about a week or so into this project of trying to keep fire out of the cabin, that we would have been better off buying the cabin.
Yeah.
And scraping it and bringing fire down. It would have been cheaper. It would have been more effective. We would have gotten more acres at a cost savings to the government, right? And the owner would have had their cabin sold instead of a protected cabin in the middle of an area that just had been burned. So it spoke to how there are all these layers that come together, and we can't. When we prioritize one thing, structures above all others, or one thing, whatever that one thing is above others, we end up with second and third order effects that aren't good.
So is there some scenario where there's an emergency use of eminent domain? And say,
I'm not aware of it.
For the greater good of these 10,000 homes, these three have to be sacrificed, purchased by the tax.
I agree with the concept. Yeah, the execution would be really tricky because who gets to decide? And under what circumstances?
You do, Dave.
Yeah, not me. No. I'll pass on that one. No, that's I bet it is one of those challenges as a society. I think we have to work through the idea that there are going to be some there are going to be some tough decisions to be made here, and it can't be blue skies every day and fire adaptation. We have to accept some smoke in the air. We're going to have to accept some impacts on a planned recurring basis that are below a certain threshold in order to avoid the catastrophes that'll unfold otherwise, and that are the sugar high of we've excluded fire is how we got here, and we're going to have to be comfortable with getting some fire on the landscape with all of the things that come to it. There's going to be some areas that look kind of black and crusty for a while after they burn. They rebound, they look better. There's going to be some smoke in the air. There's going to be some recreational areas you can't use while we're burning. All of these things are going to come together. And all three of those examples, I've seen the prescribed fire or managed fire projects turned off because of those kind of concerns. So it really is hard that we're going to have to be okay with something other than just the way it was, because the way it was isn't working. And I like to say that if someone has an objection to what we're doing, what alternative do you propose? Because the status quo is not working. It is not going to sustain much longer, particularly with the insurability components that we're seeing.
No, absolutely.
So what alternative do you propose if you object to this that we've come up with?
Yeah. And when you talk about structure protection, really we're talking about ultimately like protecting insurance companies from having to write checks for assets that are lost. I mean, that's a big component of it. That's the financial driver. And I wonder, given that the insurance companies or the insurers are the ones who, pay the price financially for suppression failures or community planning failures, et cetera, like, why don't they have a more active hand in the planning?
They do. Yeah, I think they have a very active hand, but I would just as a quick primer on insurance markets, by regulation, an insurer cannot enter into a contract to provide coverage for more than 12 months. So they don't have a lot of time to amortize the investment if they were to pay. And the question here is, and game theory is a very useful way to look at this. If we are in competition between a ratepayer and a product provider, and the ratepayer's game piece is their home, which is a fixed asset, and the provider's game piece are dollars, which are fungible and can flow to other useful purposes where they can achieve a higher return at lower risk. Adam Smith. So if that's the case, then I would argue that the onus is on the resident with the fixed asset to carry out the mitigations at the parcel and neighborhood level that reduce risk, to create an environment in which a carrier believes they can profitably write coverage and they can reasonably expect to cover their losses. And that will create a competitive environment. And in that competitive environment, multiple carriers will be vying for the business. And the amortization will flow to the homeowner, who is paid for the mitigations on their home, on the property that they own, right? That they are obligated to insure. Yeah. And then the carriers will compete for that business. Because if we try to invert that, say, look, the carrier, they don't own the property. They don't have any obligation to insure it. They are free. We can regulate how insurance is written, but we can't regulate that insurance is written. And carriers, and particularly the reinsurers who are operating at a global scale, if they can find a better investment return, that capital will flow to the investment return. So I think it's you're far from the first person who said that. Well, why isn't insurance paying for this? Well, the insurance doesn't pay for improvements. The resident pays for improvements, and then the insurer gives them credit for it. Right? When you buy a car and you check the daylight running lights,
are they giving them sufficient credit to incentive?
Okay. Yeah. No, that's the second question, right? So, and that one I think is a very interesting question, and that comes back to the initial discussion about alignment and what constitutes sufficient credit, and really what that's a different way of saying is what constitutes actual risk reduction measures. Right? If you have a community chipping program, that's good, but that doesn't actually reduce the risk because we don't know what was chipped and from where. If you have a FireWise neighborhood, that's an interesting statement of a desire to organize around wildfire risk reduction measures in a community at a neighborhood level, but it doesn't actually mean that anything was done, not meaningful, right? If you have carried out a fuel break, okay, the number of acres are interesting, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those acres have reduced risk, depending on where they're sited, nor that they will continue to reduce risk in out years. And so that's the part where I think the alignment matters. And there's room for movement on both sides of the equation. Communities need to do a better job of planning and executing their treatment plans, both on and around homes and around the community, so that they meaningfully reduce risk. I agree with that. Carriers need to do a better job of ingesting that data so that the insurance rates are accurate, not affordable, but accurate. That they accurately price the risk driven by the conditions on the ground, and they are updated at a sufficient cadence that they account for changes, good and bad. But one of the catches here that I find fascinating is there are a number of communities that have done a lot of work and collected a lot of data, and they're extraordinarily reticent to share that data with the insurance industry. So if we have done this many things that are that good, well, wouldn't we want to tell everyone about it? And so we have a bit of a standoff where the residents and communities say, what guarantee is there if I do these things that there will be a discount? And the insurance industry says, well, we're a regulated industry, we can't collude, and no one carrier is going to write all the policies. So we can't make any guarantees, but show me a community that's done the work and we'll start pricing. And we're in a standoff between the two where neither party wants to be the mover. And so residents are saying, well, I want guarantees that things will be done. And carriers are saying, show me communities that have done this work with verification. And also because of the network effect of fire, it's not, there's a threshold below which all of the activity is meaningless. Because right, if you're wearing a helmet and you get hit hard in the chest, you still got hit, right? You need to cover all of the vulnerabilities, because unlike other perils, flood being an example, if you have a small hole in your roof, you have a leak. If you have not a flood, right? But if you have a small amount of fire in the wall of your house, you have a total loss. And so below a certain threshold, you don't get partial treatment. And that's hard to wrap your head around, especially when those treatments involve things like zone 0. And we're asking residents to remove everything that'll burn within 5 feet of the structure, and to include a wooden fence. And so then you hear, this is an insurance crisis, something has to be done. And in the next breath, but zone 0 is too extreme. So, well, it can't be both a crisis and not important enough to remove the juniper, the boxwood, whatever you have planted in the Italian cypress, whatever you have planted next to your house. And that's a hard nut to crack, because the carriers say, look, I need to see proof that the risk has been removed. And the residents say, well, I want credit for things that I have decided are meaningful, not what the science has decided.
Oh, fascinating. Wow. So let me ask you, in your own life and career, like in the massive complexity of the wildfire issue, you're one of the people who has nobody's got a full wrap on it, but you've got a pretty darn good set of insights and perspectives and ideas. How do you weigh the need to plug what you know into the fire world against your obligations as a fire chief in a community?
Well, the good news is I don't have too much longer, because I'm retiring in 2 weeks. So, so I'm going to be a former fire chief here at the end of the year, and then I can focus on things to the Cal Chiefs in the Western at a broader scale. But it's a great question. That my commitment and my obligation is to the community. On the other hand, I have learned a great deal from others. Frank Freevault, Nancy Watkins, Bob Roper, Kate Dargan, who have gone before me, and their willingness to share both insights and time and mentoring with those of us who are coming up behind them made possible a lot of the work we have done here in the fire district. And so there, the commitment is how do we share what the aggregate of what I've learned from others, plus what I have learned from my time here with others. Because in the case of the fire district or any community, our wildfire risk is emanating from outside the fire district boundaries. Right? We don't control the land where the fire will come from. We don't control the mitigations that are or are not being put into place on the adjacent communities that fire must travel through to get to the homes that I'm charged with protecting. And so therefore, it's critically important that we are all sharing best practices. We're all moving forward together, understanding that it's not in lockstep, but because we're all in this together. The network effect is the first part, that from a fire science side. And from the social side, the first question you get if you try to do something progressive is, who else is doing this, right? And if we're advancing zone 0 and no one else has done this, why why us? What's it about this district that's so different? Or what is it about the implementation of these treatments in this district that will be effective if our neighbors haven't done it? And fire,
Right.
hey there, smart fire chief. You showed me a model that showed fire coming through Lafayette into Orinda and Moraga. If they're not doing this, then what's the value of us doing it? There's not a
Yeah.
particularly good answer to that.
Right. No, it's like Hassan Mahmood's research where he's using disease, modeling as a
Yeah,
comparative.
absolutely. Yeah, contagion.
You're the only person who gets vaccinated.
Yeah. Now, there's a contagion and a critical mass on both fire science and on the social component to it as well. And then, especially in an area where residents have a second home somewhere else, they instantly compare the standards you're proposing to what they have seen somewhere else. And then there's whataboutism kicks in very quickly.
Wow. I guess the more you examine it, the more potentially discouraged you are at just the mass of the problem.
I think that's right, Steve. And it's hard not to sort of get down to the weeds on this, but I think the thing I always come back to is in the WUI space, the thing we're responding to is too many homes have burned. Right?
Yeah.
That's affecting insurance and a lot of other things as well. And the way to prevent homes from burning is implementing the defensible space and home hardening measures that we understand. Right? Thinning and limbing trees in zone 2 from 100 to 30 feet, really thinning and limbing from 30 to 5 feet, removing all things that will burn in zone 0 within 5 feet of the structure, replacing wood shake roofs, of which there are very few left anyway, replacing vents to ember resistant models or 1/8 or finer mesh, and removing those things near the home that'll burn. Right? If we do those things and we do some thoughtful treatments along the landscapes that are approaching those areas, and we do them at scale, we can swing that needle right away. And there's something like 13 million residents in the WUI. And if you look at it from a top-down centralized approach, oh my gosh, 13 million people, how are we ever going to reach them all? How are we ever going to get enough resources? But if outreach, education, incentives, and engagement can engage 26 million hands, each one of those people with 2 hands can go out and do some small amount of meaningful work that's aligned around these things that we know are effective. And we can move this needle very, very quickly if we were able to engage people bottom up. And the science is there. The research has been done. This isn't a problem that requires more study and deliberation. This is a social science problem of execution at this point. And that's where we're at.
So kind of all, right?
It is. It's complex and there's a lot of moving parts, but the core thing, and the thing we're going to do eventually, is defensible space and home hardening in a thoughtful manner, looking at what are the treatments that are the most efficacious, and where do they need to be located, and ready break, let's go do that. And then we will have scenarios in which fires burn near a community, the community has a positive outcome, and they have the insurability, and they have all these other things that ripple from that. And we can point to everyone else. Just it's getting folks to be willing to go first and do a little bit of uncertainty.
The fire-dependent landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's going to burn. It's just a matter of when.
Boy, Dave, thank you so much for joining me on the Fire Break today. What an incredible resource you are, a gem of knowledge in the way you phrase it as well. Just so useful and valuable. I can't thank you enough.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. This is Dave Winnacker, the current and for a few more weeks longer fire chief in the Moraga-Orinda Fire District, and soon to be a force on his own for changing the fire landscape politically, physically, etc. Thanks so much again, Dave, and thanks all for joining us again today on the Fire Break. The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire. Until I see you next time, take care and be well, and don't start any fires that you don't mean to.